Welcome to 1850 Main Street, a place where friends get together and talk about their country and hope for a brighter future. Today, Rob Walgate and Alan C. Duncan from the Public Square are joined by David Zanotti, the CEO of the American Policy Roundtable.
You've probably heard the phrase, if you're not laughing, you're crying, and it can certainly feel that way during election season. But how else does laughter relate to politics and worldview?
Well, DZ, I have to ask you, as an author and a historian on Washington, 2 times on Saturday Night Live over the last 16 months, Nate Bargatze has been on there and has portrayed the general. Have you watched, and what do you think of those skits?
Yeah, there's so many people talking about it. How do you escape it? So yes, I did watch, and they're clearly onto a theme. I don't know whether that theme came from Bargatze's pen or if it came out of the writers. I don't know who went on to the theme of American language.
I heard it came from him. I thought I could be wrong, and I'm sure everybody threw ideas in, I would imagine, in a writer's room. But I thought it originated with him. So I don't know. We'll have to chase that down and see.
It sounds like him for sure.
It does.
Well, it's certainly classic comedy based on language and the differentiation and the inconsistencies in any language, but let alone the English language. So, they're on strong ground, and they're doing it really well. And it's really pretty funny.
SNL has been much discussion of folks I heard over the weekend. And one of the reasons for that is they've always went after politicians, and they've always made jokes and had their impressions. I mean, we can think back through the years at some of the great ones, but they do seem to be going at the Democrat ticket for president a little bit stronger than people thought they would. Now, I think they're hitting a home run with the impressions and with the parodies. They're doing an amazing job, but the Harris Walls ticket, they seem to be going after pretty hard.
Well, there's some stuff ripe for the picking there. Look, Trump has been, laughed at and mocked and caricatured for years, and there's a lot to do with it. And so I think I'm glad to see that they're kind of punching both ways on this. And yeah, Maya Rudolph's impression of Kamala Harris is hilarious. She's very funny. So yeah, it's worth watching just to see that.
Well, I just wonder if they're out of personnel with Alec Baldwin not doing Trump. I mean, when you've actually defined the role, what do you do? How do you get back?
It's been tough. They did try and portray Trump a little differently over the weekend, but they were no one's going to do it as well as Baldwin. That's for sure. But they did the Steve Harvey, what was it, Family Feud game show? The Family Feud game show was a skit that had a lot of people laughing.
Well, no, do you know who does have a good Trump impersonation? And I am not co-signing all of this person's comedy, okay? It is not family friendly. But Shane Gillis, does an amazing Trump impression. And there's a bit where he describes all you have to do a Trump impression. I'm not going to try to do it because I'm going to butcher it, but it's very funny. He literally walks you through the steps of doing a Trump impersonation.
Well, I did notice that they brought Dana Carvey back to do Biden.
That was a great
one of the skits.
Yeah,
so good.
That was a pretty significant moment.
Yeah.
If you go back to the history of Dana Carvey and Mike Myers, and I'm sure there's people wondering, saying, excuse me, you guys are normally having conversations that are pretty weighty, pretty substantive. What's the chit chat about comedy and why are you doing this? You're making me think you're just now becoming like everybody else in a world that seems to be desperate for meaning. We're falling down the drain again of meaninglessness. I can feel that coming. Alan, you're shaking your head. You're not buying.
No. Well, first of all, sometimes in a political season, if you're not laughing, you're crying. So sometimes some good humor is very needed and goes a long way. So if someone doesn't want to laugh, well, okay, sorry. I'm sorry if you don't want to laugh or talk about something funny. But I think it's very important to see when the mainstream media, and is anybody more mainstream than NBC and Saturday Night Live, when they start to kind of, like I said, take some shots, punch both ways, I think it signals a bit of a shift. I don't know exactly what it means, but I think you should at least take note of it and notice that it's happening.
I was talking to my 16-year-old over the weekend about that because I watched the clip multiple times. once with him, once with my wife, and he said something about it. He said, we haven't watched Saturday Night Live. I noticed that you've watched it, though, the past few weeks with the clips. And I said, well, I remember growing up as a kid that when they took shots at everybody, they would go after everybody. And I said, I think we were better off as a society for it when the people on television aren't picking sides. They're just having at it and being comics and not allowing the political realm to get into it. And I think that way with all of theater. I mean, I can think back to the production of Hamilton when the vice president was there, Mike Pence was there, and they stopped it and wanted to give him a lecture on the way out. I mean, we don't need that. Like,
now, I don't think that was the original cast. I'll just say this. I know some conservative folks, people in my family who will not watch Hamilton to this day because that occurred. And I'm like, well, you're missing a good musical.
Oh, yeah.
You don't have to
still
agree.
Watch it. You should still watch it. I'm just saying the intent of it was, I feel like we can never check our politics at the door to have. And even if we don't want to check our politics at the door, that's fine. Bring the worldview in, but then have a respectful discussion about it. Don't talk down to people.
Well, you guys are moving now into another direction here. We're talking about a situation where the role of theater and the role of theater in regards to, and you brought, here you're bringing us right back to Washington again, and the whole Washington and Hamilton story, which is a bit underplayed in the musical, but then again, it's a big book that Miranda was working out of and two very large lives. But Hamilton and Washington were very close. They weren't close in age. George Washington was not quite old enough to be Hamilton's father, but certainly to be an older brother. And since George Washington lost both his dad and his older brother, it's just an interesting dynamic in that. Of course, Hamilton came to this country and left pretty much all of his family behind. So that dynamic is pretty significant.
iVoters.com changes everything about the way we process elections. Instead of negative TV and radio ads and biased opinions from editorial boards, now people in all 50 states can get the facts about candidates and ballot issues from a nonpartisan, independent source. iVoters is fast, free, secure, and powerful. With iVoters, you can vote with confidence and encourage others to do the same. Free minds, free speech, free agents. iVoters.com, a public service of the American Policy Roundtable.
Now, let's go back to NBC for a while. The worst location to be looking for objective news in America is NBC News out of New York. That's my personal opinion. I've watched over the years how that particular spot in the array of news distribution centers is really pretty dark and pretty bitter and pretty non-objective, incredibly biased. A lot of hit stories come out of NBC News New York. We got to remember that NBC is owned by Comcast Universal. So that's the Roberts family from Philadelphia. And they own that I don't even know what you call that, publicly traded, but still family controlled. I don't know what word you'd have to create. It'd have something, it would have to have Opolis at the end of it because it's just this massive, massive thing. That being said, Saturday Night Live has to be understood in context, and I would submit this is the reason why. We are living in a world that is dominated by television. Now, the boomer generation was the first generation that had television that dominated their lives, but boomers weren't born. All of them weren't born into TV. TV was just getting there in the 50s. So the youngest boomers represent the first generation that has been, in essence, dominated. Every generation after them has been dominated by American television. Now, there's a question with now the new digital technologies, whether that pattern will stay or whether, in fact, it will be other means and other methodologies. But and Lorne Michaels has been on Saturday Night Live, on and off, but mostly on for 50 years. Now, show me some series that's run in America for 50 years. You won't find one.
I mean, yeah, it's an institution. It's a comedy institution.
Yeah, and the cast is a who's who of comedic genius through the years. I mean, you look at the alumni that have passed through. Is that 30 Rock? Is that where that
Yes.
Saturday Night Live is on 30 Rock? And I mean, it's amazing the influence they've had on American culture and politics.
It's a launch pad, from SNL to late night hosting or film, television, all that kind of
Shane Gillis
stuff.
got canceled from Saturday Night Live before he even assumed a role on Saturday Night Live. He didn't keep his job.
Yeah, for a joke that people felt was racially insensitive, they told on a podcast. And so I think some that's where some people, and listen, I'm not weighing in either way. I don't remember the joke if I even ever heard it, but that's what people started looking at SNL as. You used to be somebody who was on the cutting edge and you're willing to go at power, and now you've become an opolis. To your point, you've become an institution, and sometimes when you become an institution, you lose your edge. Comedy's supposed to be funny, okay? It's not supposed to necessarily be politically correct. Now, you don't want to be mean, but it's supposed to be funny. And so maybe they're getting a little bit of their mojo back. Maybe.
Julie, the countdown's on, Alan, and the over and odd numbers are shifting here quickly, but Rob, he has yet to bring up G.K. Chesterton. Who,
I wasn't even going to.
Was a master of mirth in regards to his ability to write and to persuade and to debate and to win the public opinion using a great amount of humor. I mean, Chesterton, humor was, if not his strongest weapon, certainly one of his strongest weapons that he utilized, or tools that he utilized in public discourse.
There's a beautiful quote from C.S. Lewis, and I don't have it off the top of my head, but he kind of talks about that lightness, that humor as kind of as the sword that he used. He wields it as a weapon, because he's not just doing it just to be funny for funny's sake. He's making a point, trying to make a good point with what he's saying.
At the end of Orthodoxy, Chesterton did something that was quite surprising in the very last page, as he had been writing about his personal faith pilgrimage. And he was very uncomfortable writing an autobiographical approach, but he kind of felt pushed into it by some of the people he'd been debating, who were calling him out saying, why don't you tell us the whole story about you? And he did, and it's one of the most intriguing books ever written in the 20th century, and certainly one that every person would benefit from reading. But in the very close, he's spending a lot of time talking about the person of Jesus Christ, because Chesterton obviously had become a believer, and explaining what happened to him, because he didn't start out in that position, caused him to spend a good amount of time talking about the character of God and the incarnation, the notion that God would come to earth, and what was he like when he was here. And in the closing pages, he lets on that in his view of studying Jesus at that point in his life, Chesterton felt like Jesus had a secret that he was always keeping, and that the secret that he was keeping, Chesterton described as his mirth. M-I-R-T-H, not a word we hear all that often, his mirth. In other words, Chesterton was saying that there was always a smile not very far from the surface when you studied Jesus, because he knew something none of the rest of us knew, and it made him smile.
Hearing you say that was the first time I ever heard about G.K. Chesterton. You did a TPS2 broadcast, a Public Square 2-minute broadcast where you recounted that, and I thought, I've got to read more of this man's writings. So that was the first time I ever heard of G.K. Chesterton, was you telling that conclusion to orthodoxy. So, because it blew my mind.
Do you realize what's just happened here, Rob? Go ahead. You can say it out loud. Say what you're thinking. I know what you're thinking.
It's your fault.
I did this. I did this.
You created a monster.
You created this monster.
You created a monster.
And turned him into an author as well. Gilbert and Jack. Excellent, excellent piece that you can find online at thepublicsquare.com. You can find it on our phone app as well. It is well worth your time and energy. So I think mirth matters. I think Chesterton led us to that. And I think that if we truly, honestly, I think we could go to Tolkien as well, in Tolkien's whole concept of joy in regards to the eucatastrophe, how Tolkien created out of 3 Greek words, one word that had never really been seen before.
Yeah, he liked to make up language, didn't he? He liked
pretty
to
good
invent
at
language.
that.
It's kind of his thing.
And since Rings of Power is such a big deal right now, we can go to Tolkien. And what does the eucatastrophe mean? The eucatastrophe was what Tolkien's understanding, the realization that for all the magic in fairy stories, he would have called them fairy stories, not fairy tales, fairy stories, and the predictable parts of those fairy stories and the desire that we had for them to end in a happy fashion, that the greatest of all stories, which happens to be true, is the story of the eucatastrophe of Jesus Christ. Something so good, someone so wonderful, who ended up in such a horrible situation in his crucifixion and his death, ends up rising from the dead and then telling us all this was for you. Now you can come home again. And what blew Tolkien away was the fact that that story, of all the stories, was the one you would hope that it would not be a fairy story, but would be true. And it is. Another situation where a person came to faith who didn't start there. And then, of course, we could go into Lewis and the impact that Tolkien had on Lewis. And I mean, there's a lot of people to study who didn't start with faith, who came to faith through joy.
Yeah, Lewis and Chesterton in particular, they came through kind of dabbling in the occult, which is some very dark stuff. And it's interesting in their writing, you can tell they're familiar with evil, and that's how they can fight it so well.
Well, and you have those folks that do dabble in that in the sense, and then they become a believer. They have that conversion. And then those are some of the strongest believers, strongest writers, best apologists you have, because they can argue both sides, but they know true truth.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, we got to go back to Lorne Michaels, because for years, political pundits, and you might count us in some of that on occasion, would try to gauge what the momentum of an election would look like based upon which way had Lorne tipped the scales, which way did the writing room decide to go. And so it's just inevitable. People are going to do that. So I will tell you that based on everyone saying you got to watch, I did watch several of the skits. The most significant thing that I saw was at one point, I think it was right after the Bergazzi, George Washington in the boat skit, the camera came out wide before they went to commercial. And you know who was standing right in the center of the screen in a suit with his silver hair? Lorne Michaels. He doesn't show up on camera ever by coincidence. What does it mean? Beats the heck out of me. It's just Lorne Michaels being Lorne Michaels, making everybody guess.
I found the quote of Lewis describing Chesterton's humor. Can I read it?
Sure.
It's from his book, Surprised by Joy. I always found this interesting. He said, his humor, Chesterton's humor, was the kind which I like best, not jokes embedded in the page like currants in a cake, but the humor which is not in any way separable from the argument, but is rather, as Aristotle would say, the bloom on the dialectic itself. The sword glitters not because the swordsman set out to make it glitter, but because he is fighting for his life and therefore moving it very quickly.
The conversations are just getting started. To get connected, check out 1850mainstreet.com. We don't data mine anyone or sell your information. Subscribe today so you don't miss a single conversation. We'll see you next time here at 1850 Main Street.